art achieved the perfect balance of skill, technique, and passion. The star baker this week is Colin!
Yeah! I really can't believe it. I'm star baker on bread week. I don't make bread, so it was a surprise to do well in the signature. It was a huge surprise to be #1 in the technical, and then winning star baker was like a dream come true that I didn't know was a dream.
Look at the crab shell. That's beautiful. Good bake, good taste.
Thank you so much. Hello?
Yeah?
Guess what?
What?
I'm star baker this week.
Oh my God, Colin. Oh my goodness. Wow.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Science of Cookies. My name is Kausar, and I am so excited to be your host today. I am also the Programs Manager and Science Communicator at RCI Science. Now, I'm going to be honest with all of you. As the Programs Manager at RCI Science, in coordinating and developing this event, it was honestly all about me being able to bake and make cookies rather on the job. It has nothing to do with connecting Canadian scientists with the community. It has nothing to do with sharing science with the public. Honestly, it just has to do with me loving cookies and wanting to bake on camera. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be making some cranberry shortbread, or rather cranberry chocolate shortbread cookies today. And I'm super excited to bake along with all of you. Thank you for joining us as we bake along for the next hour. So I'm super excited to get into it. But before we do, I want to make a land acknowledgement. So at RCI Science, we believe it's important to acknowledge the traditional land that we're on. I'm joining from Brampton, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Attawandaron, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to reside on this land. As settlers on Turtle Island, we acknowledge that this is just a first step in reconciliation efforts. As you could be joining us from anywhere on this virtual platform, we encourage you to learn more about the land that you reside on by visiting native-land.ca. A few housekeeping notes as well. As we bake along, feel free to join in on the conversation. You can submit your questions and comments in the comment section or in the chat box. You can also tweet us at RCI Science, or feel free to email information@rciscience.ca. We'll be monitoring all these questions, and I'll try my best to answer any questions or bring in some comments as well. We'd love to know how you're enjoying tonight's presentation, so if you snap any pictures of your baking or of your cookies at the end, we'd love for you to tag RCI Science on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We'd love to see your end product. We'd love to see your cookies and maybe even the mess that you'll be making. So feel free to tag us. And just a little reminder, please be polite and respectful. We do have moderators monitoring the chats and the comments, so please be respectful. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first baker. I'd like to welcome Colin.
Hello, my friends. Hi, Kausar. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited about tonight. I'll give everybody a little bit of information about me. You already saw a little bit about me right off the top of the stream, but my name is Colin Asuncion. I live in Toronto, and I do a whole bunch of different things. So I work in marketing communications for a multicultural ad agency. I also am a singer and a stage performer. And then, of course, I was on the Great Canadian Baking Show, which is what skyrocketed this other stream of my life and this other stream of my career, which I'm so excited to share with you tonight. But fun fact, speaking of science, I actually started my academic journey in university in life sciences. I spent a whole year in life sciences because I thought I was going to be a doctor. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. But I find it so interesting that later in life, as if I'm like near the end of my life, but further into my adult life, I've now sort of come back to science by way of baking, which is a very delicious form of science, which we're going to engage in tonight. So excited about tonight. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And I think we have a couple more special people to introduce. So Kausar, I'll pass it over to you again.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Colin. We're super excited to have you join us. And we also have two more bakers joining us today. We have two food scientists, Dr. Prue and Michael, and I'm super excited to introduce them as well. So hello, Amy.
Hi, everyone. I'm just so glad to be with all of you. And when I got the email from Kausar and Carrie, also at RCI Science, and they mentioned that Colin was coming, I had a fangirl moment going, oh my gosh, I get to bake with Colin, because I adore the Great Canadian Baking Show. I'm a food scientist. My PhD is in food science. And I actually, my fun fact, I suppose, is that I paid for a lot of my undergrad education at the University of Guelph by selling cookies. And my mom's friends needed cookies for the holidays, and I would go and bake thousands and thousands of cookies to help pay my tuition. But I love that baking is both incredibly scientific, but it's also magical, that it brings people together in a really fun and meaningful way, and it just creates so many good moments. But we're gonna have some fun with the chemistry today too.
I'm super excited. Thank you for sharing that. And our fourth baker, Michael.
Hello, everyone. Hello. It's, as everyone said, it's a pleasure to be here. I too am a great lover of the Great Canadian Baking Show. Absolutely a joy to watch. I'm extremely happy to be here. I'm actually based in rainy Vancouver. Actually, today I think it's snowing. But I'm a technical advisor for Puratos Canada out here out west. And I help create all those little things that we're doing today and bring them on the mass market industrially to share with everyone here in Canada. I love baking, everything from small cookies to breads to chocolates. I love sharing baked goods. I think it's something that brings everyone together. And I'm super excited to be here to make something with everyone today.
I love that. Ooh, I'm getting hungry. That is what I am getting. Oh, okay. So we're going to get started. Colin, you will be leading our bake along. I will be baking along with you. Michael will also be baking along with us. So we're all going to kind of bake together. For our viewers, any amateurs out there, I love baking, but I would not consider myself a professional. I would never, you'd never find me on the Great Canadian Baking Show, that's for sure. So if you need someone to kind of relate to, I will be the one. So Colin, take us away.
All right, and I will say, you never know. Never say never. Maybe one day you will be in the tent and you could win the Great Canadian Baking Show. Who knows, And today might be the start of that journey for us all. But speaking of starting the journey, what's that?
I'll mention that in my winning speech.
Please do, as you collect that beautiful crystal plate, which I did not win, but alas, we'll get into that during another live session. So everyone, I'm going to take you through everything that you need in terms of ingredients as well as equipment. But before I do that, everyone, I would encourage you to preheat your oven now to 375 Fahrenheit and set your rack to the middle position. So again, that's 375 and rack in the middle position. And then what I'm going to do is read out all the ingredients as well as the quantities of those ingredients, and then also the equipment. Don't be afraid if you don't have everything in those quantities already laid out, because I'm going to be repeating those quantities throughout the bake. Also, I should mention, this is such a simple recipe. We're making chocolate chunk cranberry shortbread cookies. It couldn't be simpler, honestly. We had a meeting earlier this week about the science behind these cookies, and even though it is a simple cookie, there are a lot of scientific elements and I'll just say sciencey things that are happening, which I won't be discussing, but my two co-bakers will be discussing. So again, your oven 375, rack middle position, and these are the ingredients that you're gonna need to make these delightful, delicious cookies. So you're gonna need 1 cup or 2 sticks of unsalted butter at room temperature. It's very important that it's at room temperature, which I will not discuss the science behind that, but it is coming. If it's not at room temp yet, I would encourage you to just pop it in the microwave for like 5 to 10-second bursts. You don't want to get it melted, but you do want that butter to be room temperature and slightly softened. You're also going to need half a cup plus 2 tablespoons of icing sugar or confectioner's sugar, a 1/4 cup of cornstarch or rice flour, 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, half a teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, and then your inclusions. And in this case, it's half a cup of either chopped chocolate or chocolate chips, and you can use dark, milk, or white chocolate for that. And then half a cup of chopped dried cranberries, or I'm actually using chopped dried cherries today for a little extra tartness, but it's really up to you and up to your palate. Again, we'll be mentioning those ingredients and the quantities throughout the bake. So if you don't have everything out right now, that's okay. You'll definitely be able to follow along. Now, in terms of equipment, so you're going to need a baking sheet or 2 and parchment paper, not wax paper, because if you bake with wax paper, wax gets in your food, you're eating wax. That's gross. We don't want that. So again, a baking sheet and parchment paper. You'll of course need measuring cups and measuring spoons to get those ingredients in the right quantities. You'll want to have a rubber or silicone spatula. Any sort of flexible spatula would be great. If you don't have one of these, a wooden spoon is fine, or just like a dinner spoon is fine too. You're going to need, I like to have, speaking of spoons, I like to have a dinner spoon on hand for when I'm scooping out the dough and forming them into balls. You could use an ice cream scoop, or you could honestly just use your hands. That's fine as well. You're going to also need, of course, bowls galore. I always say like have like 2 to 3 mixing bowls. Honestly, take out every bowl from your cupboard. You'll probably need it. I'm just kidding. Just a few is fine. One big one is the main one that you'll need. And you'll need, of course, your oven and a whisk. I don't know why I wrote oven before whisk, but hey, the mind works in fun ways. And then, of course, a mixer. I don't know if I mentioned mixer. Today, I'm using my hand mixer, my handy dandy hand mixer. I got this in like, I don't know, 2014. It has lasted me however many years that is. You can use a hand mixer. You can use a stand mixer as well, whatever you prefer. I think, Kauser, you're using a stand mixer today. And I know Chef Michael is using an industrial tabletop mixer. So we're all taking different mixy journeys today, which is very exciting. But just goes to show that you don't need any fancy professional equipment to get this cookie done. Okay, so we're going to get started on our first few steps. And then I should note that we are going to have what we're going to call like science interludes or like science moments where Dr. Amy Prue and Michael, they're going to take you through the science of these cookies and the science of baking overall. But let's go ahead and get started. So we have our large mixing bowl, and to this, I'm going to add my butter. And again, that's 1 cup or 2 sticks of unsalted room temperature butter. Put that right in the bowl of your mixer or the mixing bowl that you're using. And again, if it's not room temperature yet, just pop it in the microwave for just like 5 to 10 seconds in little bursts until it gets to the temperature you want. And then I'm going to beat this for 1 minute until it is nice and fluffy. And this is actually when we're going to have our first science interlude. So please, my friends, take it away while I beat this butter for a minute.
Oh my gosh. So let's see if Carrie is going to pop my slide up for Carrie Boyce, the executive director, is our behind the scenes person. But what our good friends are doing right now is they're actually making a dispersion. I love to think about all the wonderful dispersions that are in foods. And it just happens that they're making an oleo foam. And if you think about the words oleo, oil, and they're making a foam, they're putting air into that oil. And well, how's the chemistry working behind this? Well, it just happens that butter is partly liquid oil and partly solid oil. And so if you're pulling butter straight from the fridge, it's almost 100% solid oil. Whereas if it's at room temperature, a certain percentage of it is still in the solid phase and part of it is in the liquid phase. We don't think of it as a liquid, but it's an oleo gel where there's solid crystals that are suspended within a liquid oil matrix. The nice thing about the fact that we've still got some solid crystals is that they help to stabilize the air or the foam that we need to be creating. Because in the case of shortbread cookies, we don't have any of the chemical leaveners that are so common that we see in many other types of cookies. We often will see baking soda in products that have a lot of acidity, whereas in many cookies that don't have acidic ingredients, maybe apple or lemon or orange, we're going to instead use a baking powder that contains an acidic ingredient that then catalyzes that baking soda. Baking soda will, just like that children's experiment, when in the presence of acid, it will release carbon dioxide, but it can also degrade in heat as well. But it's even more effective when it's with acid. In the case of our shortbread, you notice there's no baking powder, no baking soda. And so we need to have that leavening by mechanical action of that oleo foam.
And to add on to that, what Dr. Amy was saying is that we also need the butter to be at room temperature. And why is it critical that it's at room temperature? It's because of pliability. When we have it in the fridge and it's stacked on top of each other, we'll see that the bonds and the molecules of fat are stacked on top of each other, and will not be able to fit in air molecules because they are stacked too closely together. However, when we have pliable room temperature butter, and we force in sugar to that, we can allow air to come into that more easily. Also, another key factor is sugar granulation size. Different granulations of sugar can bring in different factors of air. Coarser sugar is able to essentially drag in more air. So when we whip something with higher granulations, we'll achieve more aeration inside the membranes of the fat than we would if we have tiny molecules of sugar. However, for this specific cookie, we want very tiny granulations of sugar because we want that mouthfeel where the sugar is just going to melt. We're not going to feel any grit because of the low water in this cookie.
Perfect. And speaking of sugar, I think we're ready to add some sugar to the situation, actually. So that was a perfect segue. So we have our whipped butter, and that's been whipped for 1 minute on high, or beat on high for 1 minute. And now we're going to add that icing sugar. And again, that's ½ a cup plus 2 tablespoons of icing sugar. I'm adding that all into my mixture, and then I'm going to beat that again for about 30 seconds. And I'll just show you, whenever you're beating something like a powder in a mixer, whether it's cake or bread or cookies, always start on low, and that will help you avoid getting that like icing sugar or flour cloud of all that powder just spreading all over your area. And then once your mixture is a little clumpy and there's no like loose powder, then you can turn it on high. So I'm going to do that just until it gets fluffy again, just about 30 seconds. I'm using my hand mixer, so I have a great deal of control as to where my mixture is in the bowl. I can actually also hold the bowl up and move the bowl around with my mixer like this. So really using like both of my hands to really control what's going on, and that'll help me, again, make sure I get full control of the mixture and really get good dispersion of everything. I'm also going to take my my spatula and scrape the sides and the bottom of my bowl at least once or twice, just to make sure that you're getting everything properly mixed up. And you're going to want to do that pretty much with any recipe, really, because there are some areas that your mixer might miss, whether it's a stand mixer or a hand mixer. So this is looking good. It's been about 30 seconds. And now I'm going to add in my cornstarch, or rice flour. So that's a ¼ cup of cornstarch or rice flour, and we're going to add all of that in right into our mixture. And then we're going to beat again, starting on low, so that we can avoid that powder cloud, and then bringing it up to high for about 30 seconds. So we get a nice, even, smooth mixture. I apologize if this is super noisy. Baking can be a noisy affair, I will say. Scraping the sides and bottom of my bowl, of course.
And I actually have a question from one of our viewers. Can you open the butter and the sugar?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I had a bit of a audio hiccup.
Can you overmix the butter and the sugar? So can you overmix the butter and sugar?
So, fun question. I'm gonna leave it to the scientists to answer that.
I had a glass of water and I muted myself. Yes, any sort of dispersion, there is the potential of over shearing that dispersion. And so while I think in general butter and sugar is pretty forgiving, it's not like whipped cream where you start to actually change the physical chemistry. At the same time, you do not want to over disperse and create too much aeration in that, because it will start to collapse on itself. Michael, do you have any comments? He's nodding his head.
Yes. Butter, when we add sugar into things, sugar can act as a forgiving agent, so to speak. So when we think of like egg whites, if we were to mix egg whites with and without sugar, we can see that when we add sugar, we're adding instability to the item that we're whipping. Butter is more forgiving because it's high in fat. However, butter is held together a lot by the casein proteins that are within the butter itself. And like any protein, as Dr. Amy has just said, we can over shear it. And if you keep whipping and whipping and whipping butter, you can break up the protein so much that the oil that Dr. Amy mentioned before, because some of it is liquid oil and solid oil, they can come apart and now you have split butter.
The other thing that it dawned on me, the more you apply shear to a system, the more you're heating it. And so you overmix it and you're going to start to melt your butter.
I like that. I feel like these questions are questions that I always face when I'm baking, because I'm always wondering, am I over baking it? Am I under baking? Mixing rather. Am I over mixing? Am I under mixing? It's always something I'm always worried about. And we have a question from our viewers. What are signs of over mixing to watch out for? So in our case, we have our butter and icing sugar, and in other kind of butter and sugar mixing situations. What are some signs of over mixing?
Overmixing can be in different forms. There can be overmixing when we have a gluten matrix when we're making bread, and we can have overmixing in an egg white emulsion when we're making whipped toppings with egg white, and the same thing with butter. What we notice most when we do things like a buttercream or making an Italian meringue, so to speak, is that there's a color change. When we start bringing in air, we increase the surface area of the product and it lightens in color. And when it lightens in color, we start to see that whiteness in the butter. So a good sign to see that your buttercream, or when we're creaming butter, it's almost near completion. We can hear the air coming in. You'll hear more of the pops coming in, but you'll also notice a color change within the product as more air gets incorporated. You'll see it turn more and more white.
In terms of overbeating, you could start to see an oily sheen separating out, and that's from overheating and the oil starting to separate. Also, you can start to see, I want to say granulation. It starts to look sandy rather than smooth and airy, that it has a sandy appearance to it. But it looks like Colin's ready to do his next step, and let's jump over to him right now.
Yeah, let's get back into the baking, but I'm loving hearing the science behind some of these signs that I myself have experienced as well as a home baker. And it's just very cool to understand like what those visual cues, like what's actually behind those visual cues. So I'm learning so much tonight. I love it. It's like I'm back in life sciences. Just kidding. Okay, so in a separate bowl, remember when I said take out every single bowl you have? I really meant it. So in a separate bowl, we're going to call this a small to medium bowl. We're going to add our flour. So that's 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. And to that, we're just going to add our salt, which is half a teaspoon of salt. And we're just going to give that a whisk to make sure that our salt is evenly dispersed throughout our flour powder. Won't take you too long. And then once that is nice and mixed up, we're going to add that all into the butter and the sugar and cornstarch mixture. So just dump that all in. And then we're going to mix this, again, starting on low, and then up to about medium, low/medium, until the dough starts coming together. And I'll show you the dough at various stages. And Carrie, who's online, I'm gonna ask you to show everyone my close-up cam just to start. So you can see this is after mixing it for a couple seconds. So it's a little clumpy-wumpy. And then we're gonna keep mixing on low until it gets nice and smooth. And I'll show you again. I'm using my mixer to sort of collect the sides, the dough on the side. So as you can see here now, it's really starting to come together. It's starting to collect and form kind of a mass in the center of my bowl. I'm gonna keep mixing, again, on low or like medium-low until a smooth dough is formed. So you'll see this really didn't take long. That's already done. I don't know how many seconds that was. And now I'm going to make sure that I'm scraping the sides and the bottom of my bowl, getting these chunks of dough out of my beaters of my hand mixer. Just like getting those chunks out. And now we're just going to add vanilla. So I've got vanilla extract, 1 teaspoon of that, and we're just going to splash that right into our cookie dough. And I say cookie dough because we already have cookie dough, which is amazing. Like you could bake this right now as is, well, after forming it into balls, and you'd have shortbread cookies. So I'm just giving that another mix on low just until I see it's I'll call it like a homogeneous mixture, and there's no streaks of vanilla, so no streaks of dark brown. Ooh, you can really smell that. Delicious. One trick to get the dough out of your hand mixer beaters is to just like beat it on high for a second real fast, just like above the bowl slightly, but still in the bowl. And then like all of the clumps from inside the beaters sort of like fly out, if you will. But don't raise it too high because then that will fly out all across your room. So this is our base shortbread cookie dough. I'm going to show that to my close-up cam so you can see it looks nice and smooth. It definitely looks like cookie dough. And this is a great base recipe for you to play around with. You can add so many different types of inclusions or different types of extracts. Like you could actually use a lemon extract or an almond extract in place of or in addition to the vanilla. And now we're going to play with inclusions. So those are those lovely morsels that we're going to throw in our dough to really personalize it. And today, like we mentioned, it's going to be a chocolate cranberry cookie. So I have 1/2 cup of chopped dark chocolate and 1/2 cup of chopped dried cherries, and you can use cranberries at home if you prefer. I prefer to use chopped chocolate instead of chocolate chips. Of course, either is fine. But what I like about chopped chocolate is the irregularity of mouthfeel, because you have these large chunks of chocolate, you have these little like sandy bits of chocolate, and it just makes for a really interesting culinary experience. And I find it a little bit more delicious because you got those little sandy bits of chocolate that like really melt into the dough. And I just think it's really cool and very special. And it looks really nice because it's kind of speckled throughout. So I'm going to throw all of my inclusions in. Again, that's 1/2 cup of dried chopped fruit. I'm using cherries, and 1/2 cup of chocolate. You can use dark chocolate, milk chocolate, or white chocolate. Or, I mean, there's so many different types of chocolate on the market now. There's ruby chocolate, which is really cool. It has a nice like floral and kind of acidic fruit flavor. You could use like caramelized white chocolate. I know that's big on the market. Golden chocolate. There's so many products out there. You could also use like seeds or nuts. That would be a great addition. And now I'm just using my spatula and folding those inclusions into the dough so that they're nice and evenly dispersed. And I'll show you a close-up of my dough now that I've very quickly sort of mashed it all together. It's so simple, so quick to come together, and very personalizable, customizable, I should say. So if you can believe it, our cookie dough is done. The cookie dough is literally done. You could freeze this if you're doing a make-ahead cookie dough, which I love to do for the holidays. I, in fact, made like 6 batches of cookie dough over the weekend so that I can just take them out of the freezer and bake them over the holidays. So this would be a great option for that. So now I'm going to take my baking sheet, which has parchment paper on it. I've lined it with parchment paper. Again, not wax paper, because we don't want to eat melted wax in our cookies. Parchment paper. And what I'm going to do now is spoon, like heaping tablespoon sized balls of dough onto my baking sheet. I'm going to first lightly flour my hands, and that's going to help the dough not stick to my hands. And then I'm going to take a dinner spoon, or you could take an ice cream scoop, or even just use your hands and just like really use your fingers to grab the dough. And I'll grab like a heaping tablespoon. Actually, that's more like 1.5 tablespoons. I've got a chunk of dough, and I'm just rolling it between my hands and placing it on my baking sheet. I'll move my bowl so you can see that. And I'm going to leave about 1.5 inches or so in between each dough ball because they do spread a little bit. And while I continue doing that, and while everyone is doing that at home, I think we're ready for more science, more science of baking. So I'm gonna leave it to my scientific besties to take you through that.
I love that. Thank you so much, Colin. Actually, I wanted to point out, I know now I need to be Colin's best friend. After Colin, you mentioned you have a whole bunch of cookies in the freezer. I now know who to come knocking on.
Yeah, you have my address, so come on by.
I love that. Amazing. I love how my dough looks right now. It looks very festive. I used cranberries, and I liked, Colin, you mentioned using irregular cut chocolate. I'll be sure to do that next time. This time around, I just used some chocolate chips, and I used some cranberries. Michael, did you use cranberries as well, or did you try something different?
I use craisins, so they're very nice and sweet. They're a perfect addition to this cookie.
I love that. I love that. I like that we all kind of did something different. And first thing I kind of want to mention is in the recipe, it calls for either cornstarch or rice flour. And I'm going to throw that to my food scientists. I went with cornstarch. Colin, I think you went with cornstarch as well.
That's right, yes.
And Michael, did you also use cornstarch?
I used rice flour.
Ah, okay. So we have one rice flour. What is the difference between the two? Why are we able to substitute them easily? And yeah, I'd just like to know more about the difference between those.
I'm going to jump in here while you guys shape some cookies, but if Carrie can switch me to my slide. So gluten is the wonder that makes so much of our baking successful. And in many cases, we are trying to deliberately make gluten. In the case of bread, Michael is a bread master, and I'm sure he could go on and on about the wonders of gluten. But in the case of cookies, we are on this beautiful tipping point where we want just enough gluten to hold the structure together, but not so much that our cookies become tough. And Colin was really deliberate to say, let's just mix it just enough so that we have everything come together, but we weren't mixing it for forever, because that gluten is slowly but surely forming. Now, we didn't add any liquid, but butter contains about 20% water. And that small amount of water that's there is working with the proteins that are there. Now, gluten, we talk about gluten, but gluten's actually 2 proteins. It's actually gliadin and glutenin. And these two form sulfhydryl bonds between them. And it's through that we get that elasticity that when you're stretching out, think of a pizza dough or a bread dough, when you're stretching out that dough and you've got that almost like a rubber band, these disulfide bonds that are between the glutenin and gliadin in the gluten protein allow for that elasticity. Now, by putting butter into our formulation, we're blocking the formation of some of that disulfide bond and allowing it to be much more tender. The other piece of the puzzle is when we're reducing the amount of gluten in our formation, it's less likely to form. And so I popped up one of these machines. This is what's called a farinograph. And many of our industrial bakers love seeing these sorts of charts when they're getting flours, because these charts, or what we call farinographs, are rheological charts. They show us the texture of the flour when we're mixing it together. And so I have this fun little slide here, but it's a comparison of different types of flour from AACC. AACC is the I believe it's the American Association of Cereal Chemists, and they have a lot of defined analytical methods. And so down here in the bottom right quadrant would be a very strong bread flour, where you've got a lot of gluten protein, pushing up in the 14, sometimes even higher percentages. Whereas cake flours or pastry flours tend to be very weak, and that gluten, the rheological strength of it is very, very low. What we're doing by adding cornstarch or rice flour is we're de facto creating a very weak flour so that it forms just barely enough gluten to hold together, but then it's going to start to actually break apart a bit and not make the cookies too tough, but at the same time still hold them together.
I really
Love it. And sorry, I'm just going to interrupt real briefly because I'm just about to throw my cookies in the oven. I don't want to interrupt another science break. So I'm throwing those in the oven for 18 to 20 minutes. So I'm going to pop those in again. My oven is preheated to 375. And I'm going to set my timer for 18. At 18 minutes, I'm just going to take a look at them and see if they're forming a lightly golden rim around the edges of the cookies. And if they look matte. Those are my visual cues to know that my cookies are done. You'll also smell them. Your home will fill with the delicious aroma of cookies. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we will continue learning.
Amazing. And Colin, just for curiosity, how many cookies were you able to fit on a pan?
Oh, great question. I was able to fit. Okay, this is 12, and then this is 11. 12 plus 11 is 23. See, I can do math. 23 cookies. If you did them a little smaller, you could, of course, make more, and then you'd have to adjust your bake time accordingly. If they're smaller, they'll take less time to bake, of course.
Good to know. I'm still forming my cookies. I'm just quite slow. So I'm going to continue forming my cookies, and then I'll throw them in the oven. We actually do have some more questions from our viewers, and I'll answer those first. So one of our viewers mentioned, I prefer a sprouted wheat flour as it's more nutritious than regular all-purpose flour. Does it really make that much difference in texture, taste, etc. when using organic flour, unbleached flour, light spelt flour, etc., etc.?
So that's a great question. Michael's actually an awesome, I'm going to actually put that in Michael's court because he is a genius at bread baking.
Thank you, Dr. Amy. So obviously, if we went to a bulk barn or if we went anywhere to buy flours, we have here in Canada a plethora of options from spelt, pastry flour, rye, einkorn if you're very fancy, bread flour, unbleached flour. What does it all mean? What do we do with these flours? Sprouted wheat flours is a process that when we take the hard wheat kernel, we germinate it to a certain point, stop the germination process, and then it's dried and milled into a flour. People use this flour or the grain in cooking, baking, and etc. You can use it for bread, you can use it for cookies. However, there is a stark difference between using a whole grain sprouted flour and an unbleached flour that is milled from a hard wheat and sifted to have just the endosperm, which is, as we saw in that photo from Dr. Amy, just the very center of the wheat kernel. It improves our texture of our products. It's mostly composed of starch and protein, so we get a very soft, fluffy product. Think of a nice white, fluffy bread. When we go grab it in the bakery, we can squish it. It's soft. It melts in our mouth. It instantly turns to sugar from enzymes in our saliva. This flour produces a very nice product. We can use a sprouted wheat flour. However, we're also going to be including other things other than starch and protein, including the bran, some oils from the inside of the germ, some complex starches from the aileron layer, which is the outside of the starch membrane. This will produce a product that's a little bit more dense, has a little bit more flavor. However, it might your recipe might need to change because it's going to absorb more. The bran, all the germ, all the things love water, they love moisture, and they're going to change your recipe. So we can use a sprouted flour. However, our recipe might change because it might dry out our products.
Very cool. And we actually have a timing question. Thank you so much, Michael, for answering that question. I believe one of our viewers asked, how long do the cookies stay in the oven? And Colin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's about 18 to 20 minutes. 18 likely if they're a bit smaller and fewer on your cookie sheet, and 20 I'm going to assume if they're larger and more crowded, I'm assuming.
Yes, that's right. And I should also mention that I spread my cookies across 2 baking sheets because I have a condo-sized oven, so it's basically an easy bake oven, I will say. So I did need to split them across 2 baking sheets, and this is totally fine at room temperature for a little bit while your cookies bake, and then you can just do a quick swap. Interesting fact: when you open your oven door, you do lose heat. Your oven temperature will drop, so it's very important that if you are swapping out things, if you're doing 2 batches of cookies or a cake or whatever you might be baking, just be mindful of that. Open your door really quickly, make sure to shut it right away, and account for baking time. So your second batch might take a little bit longer to bake because the oven temperature was a little bit lower to start. So just an important thing to note.
Good note. I'm definitely guilty of wanting to always open them to stare at them. So I will keep that in mind. So I'm gonna step up for a second to throw these in the oven. But before I do that, we have a question. What is icing sugar, and is it the same as regular sugar? So yeah, what's the deal with sugar?
Well, I'm sure if you've ever gone to a coffee shop, you've likely seen some of those fancy sugars that have really big granulation sizes. What icing sugar is just really, really tiny particles of the same sucrose sugar that we are experiencing in granulated sugar. But we think of the mouthfeel of some of those granules of sugar. If we've got big, huge chunks and granulations, we can feel them and they have a crunchy texture. Whereas if they're very, very fine, it has a much smoother mouthfeel. And likewise, it's going to dissolve faster in any sort of formulation. And we have a very tiny amount of moisture in our cookies from that 20% or approximately moisture that's in our butter. But some of it's going to dissolve and allow for, I want to say, a little bit better Maillard reaction within those cookies as well.
Very, very interesting. Okay. And we actually have another question as well. Someone was wondering, Michael, what size scoop are you using? You're using an industrial mixer. Are you also using an industrial scoop?
These are actually just common scoops you can get anywhere. They're quite helpful when you're doing large scale, when you're starting out to build a product from the beginning. They can help me manage consistency. And they can help process faster, as you can imagine. If you're making hundreds of these, sometimes using a teaspoon would take quite a long day to do that. Ice cream scoops can help ease the process. I'm using a standard 5 centimeter, 50 millimeter scoop, and I did do a test on these earlier, and that usually gives me about 50 grams per cookie. So I know that each cookie is about 50 grams, and it fits perfectly onto the tray.
I love the precision. I'm definitely not that precise. And although I say baking is a chemistry, and in chemistry you definitely want to be precise, I will admit that I'm not the most precise, and often I do get a little lazy. And I actually have a fun little question to ask my bakers. So I was Googling, some baking faux and things to avoid when you're baking, and one of them was never scoop your flour from the bag with your measuring cup. And I'm like, I do that 11 out of 10 times when I'm grabbing my flour. I will take my 1 cup, throw it in the bag, pull it out, and dump it. Obviously, I have some etiquette. I use a butter knife to make sure it's even. But my bakers, are you guilty of doing this? I won't share this information outside of a little call. No worries.
Okay, I'll go first. I will say, I know you're not supposed to. I know that. But knowledge does not always translate to action. So a lot of the time I will I will scoop from directly in the bag, but I know that you're not supposed to. So what I do to account for that is I often will scoop out just a little bit under the level point of the scoop to account for what would be aeration if I were to scoop from a spoon and then spoon into the cup. But sometimes I'm baking with weight instead of volume, in which case I'm not even using measuring cups and measure. And I see some thumbs up because that is, I mean, I'm going to try and be sciencey for a hot second. That is the most precise way to measure when you are baking, because then you're consistent throughout.
Perfect marks, Colin.
Thank
You're
you.
absolutely
Woo!
right. Mass is going to be consistent. Now that said, there are times, for example, right now it's winter in it's not quite winter, but it's almost winter in most of Canada, and our relative humidity in the air in our homes and in also in our factories is quite low. It's just the psychrometric properties of the air, and that then drops the amount of moisture that's in our flour. We don't think that there's water in flour, but there actually is a very small percentage of moisture. It's somewhere in the around 10 to 14%. And we need to account for that when we're thinking about our formulation. And that actually, we saw that a question came up in the chat. Why is my dough so dry and totally separated? Not sure where you're geographically located, but right now in the wintertime, oftentimes you'll have to adjust recipes slightly just to deal with the fact that the relative humidity in most of our homes is so low that it actually dries out our ingredients, and we have to put a tiny bit more moisture. But Colin's absolutely right that weight tends to be by far the most accurate. That if I'm doing my recipe here by weight, I know that Michael across the country can do the exact same recipe by weight. And then the other cool thing is Michael then could walk into a factory and make 1,000 times that same recipe by just converting it from a percentage basis. Whereas he's not going to go and measure it 1,000 cups of flour. That would just be crazy.
I love that. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We actually have another question as well. Are stevia dark chocolate chips okay to use in cookies?
Yeah, I would say yes, again, because the chocolate is really to add, in this recipe anyway, is to add a morsel. It's an inclusion. So it's meant to sort of stay independent of the rest of the cookie. We're not melting the chocolate and folding it into the batter. We're not blending the chocolate into like a powder. So really any type of chocolate that's like choppable or made into chocolate chips would be totally fine in this recipe.
Now, I have a slide and Michael and I can talk a little bit about it, but chocolate's interesting because when we bake it, we're heating it up quite considerably. And if Carrie can swap it over to our slide, chocolate has a really interesting chemistry because the texture of chocolate is really dependent on what we call fat polymorphisms. Chocolate is a crystal. I think that's maybe one of the magical things about it is that we are tasting crystals when we are melting chocolate in our mouths. And so the fat polymorphism is really important. We want to have this beta form of crystallization. And when we're heating and baking cookies, we're actually throwing out a lot of that structure. And so this is something that's worth noting that some chocolates are going to bake better. I know Michael had some really great comments in our preamble conversation. Let him jump in.
Yes, so a little bit about chocolate, and Dr. Amy is correct. When we are looking to temper chocolate, which is another word for bringing the right crystallization to chocolate to get that snap and that typical mouthfeel that we're looking for in our chocolates, what we're doing is we are melting all the crystals until there's no crystal formation, and then we cool the chocolate to a designated temperature where we promote a very certain particular type of crystal, which is the beta crystal, and then we slightly warm it up just so that we promote that beta crystal through agitation. That is tempering. And when we temper, we promote all those crystals that give us the snap and the mouthfeel we're looking for. In terms of baking with chocolate, Dr. Amy is correct. When we heat up chocolate, we completely melt it and we ruin all the crystal formation. We lose all the aspects of that chocolate. So when we're baking with a very dark chocolate, that's not high in sugar, it tends to burn if we're not careful, or dry out our products because the cocoa mass is so high that it draws in all the moisture for our crumbs. So if you've ever baked with dark chocolate and you've seen that your products have been dried, that's the reason why. Baking with chocolates that are higher in sugar or have milk protein, such as a milk chocolate or a white chocolate, we can promote a better bake because the sugar is going to melt and keep the product tender and not draw in moisture.
I saw a question come up that says, we have a double oven. The top oven is smaller, and 8 minutes, the cookies were very, very brown. And this is one of my favorite things, is to think about thermal process validations in food systems. Everyone who has an oven and really wants to be precise should have a thermometer to verify the temperature of the oven, because the dial or the digital controller on most ovens doesn't necessarily reflect exactly the temperature that's in there. Now, I had popped up a slide about the Maillard reaction. Maillard reaction is it's wonderful. It's where we've got sugars and amino acids and water and heat all coming together to create the beautiful browning that creates so much of the aromatics that we enjoy in baking. And it's a weird and wonderful chemical reaction. I remember having to learn this in my undergrad. And now that I teach undergrad food chemistry, I'm like, no, please look it up. This is a headache to try and parse through. But what's cool about Maillard reaction is that there's quite literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different byproducts that are formed through all of these different degradation processes, and they all have these wonderful aromatics. It self-catalyzes. So once you start the browning reaction, it just goes like wildfire. And so I agree that you have to get to know your oven and the intricacies of it and how accurately it is actually delivering. And the Maillard reaction starts to catalyze in the low 200s. And so for many people, especially with shortbread, where you may be wanting a slightly paler cookie, you may be finding that it works to reduce the temperature of your oven. Maybe that's a prompt for you to make the recipe again and invite some friends over to have lots of cookies and do some sensory analysis to say, which one did you prefer?
I think it's super interesting. Ovens are the worst. I've always had, it's exactly what you mentioned. Learning your oven, I think, is so important when it comes to baking, because as you mentioned, some ovens bake a lot faster than others, and keeping that thermometer in your to test your oven is a very, very good tip. Speaking of oven temperatures, I want to ask another spicy question, if you will, for my bakers. So I know in my experience, I've kept things accidentally a little too long in my oven, or I hadn't learned my oven yet. I'll use that as my excuse, and have burnt cookies here and there. And I'll admit I've grabbed a lemon zester or little grater and scraped the burnt parts off my cookies and baked goods. Bakers, have you ever done that? Again, this is a safe space, so you're welcome to tell me your deep, dark secrets.
I'm happy to jump in and talk about baking fails and baking mishaps, because even though I've been, baking at a certain level for a good amount of time now, I of course make mistakes myself, and I have definitely burned things. I've also underbaked things, and that's actually a little bit more difficult to come back from once you've brought something to room temperature. But yeah, there are mishaps all the time. I've burnt things on the Great Canadian Baking Show. But what I learned is, if you don't talk about it that much, the camera people don't know that it happened. And so they don't put that into the story. And then you just kind of fix it without drawing attention to it. But, if I've ever burned cookies, what I've done is I've done the exact same thing that you've done, Kausar, and just sort of scrape off the burnt bits. And then if it's too crispy, a great thing to do with leftover cookies or like maybe slightly overbaked cookies is chop them up and then fold them into ice cream. And it's just going to be incredible, like the most delightful dessert. It's sort of like a pseudo homemade treat. So my recommendation.
I love that. And Michael and Amy, what about you two? Have you ever had to grab out a zester or grater?
Yes, sometimes especially if you leave stuff in the oven and you forget to put your timer on. I've had that happen before, and you're talking with somebody or someone walks by you and you strike up a conversation, and knowing me, I'm very chatty, and then all of a sudden during mid-conversation you smell smoke or you smell something you're not supposed to smell, and you think, oh no, the stuff's in the oven, and you like sprint back into the center and open it, there's smoke everywhere and there's product that's burnt, and definitely had my fair share of fails, but definitely trimming, especially in tarts, if the tart shells get too dark and you're sitting there making sure they look perfect and trimming with the shaver, it's definitely happened to me.
Speaking of which, I'm just going to check on my cookies because my timer is about to go off. So, Dr. Amy Prue, I'm going to leave it to you while I check on the shortbread.
Absolutely. We had a question come in, and what is the optimum temperature for Maillard reaction and why? Well, the Maillard reaction runs across a range of temperatures, and I think in Celsius, and that's why I had that all of a sudden brain fart, because so often when we're thinking about cooking, we're in a wonderful cultural dynamic of living next to the United States, and a lot of our kitchen equipment is dictated by that Fahrenheit system that our American friends love to use. And Maillard reaction happens at 140 to 165 Celsius, and I had to look it up. That's 280 to 330 Fahrenheit. And so if you're trying to slow Maillard, you can drop your temperature. The challenge, of course, is that you also, when you're baking, you're also gelatinizing starch, and you need that starch to go through the conversion over. And the other piece of the puzzle is that you are taking the sugars in your cookie and running them through the glass transition. I actually had a slide for the glass transition because it's kind of a fun thing to think about. But the sugars that are in our product, here on our x-axis, the temperature going up, we want those sugars to be in that liquid rubbery, I know rubbery sounds weird, but almost chewy sort of state on the temperature increase. And then as it cools back down, we want it to go into the glassy state so that it's crunchy. And we've got to get the temperature high enough so that we can actually get this glass transition to occur. And so it's all this is the wonderful thing about baking, is that as much as there's chemistry involved, there's an art. And that's where folks like Colin, Michael's a great example as well, that the art of putting everything together and then being able to describe it in a way that other people can follow is a wonderful skill to be able to have. And so, yeah, glass transition modulus is so fun in cookies. How do we know when they're done?
Yes, we have a question. Colin, are your cookies done? And how do our viewers know when they're done?
Yes, my cookies are done, and I would actually love to show you on my close-up cam what they look like and what to look for in your cookies. So I'm going to try and make sure they don't fall. I'm not sure if you can tell based on the lighting, but there is a slight golden rim around each cookie. So that's a telltale sign that these are baked enough. They look matte. They're not at all shiny on top. There are some light cracks, and that's totally fine and very normal for this type of cookie because, you know, it's a short texture, so there's not a lot of liquid, and so it is like a drier dough. But yeah, this is what they should look like. You'll notice it has spread, not significantly, but you know, a decent amount. So it's a good thing that I left space in between each cookie. And again, your nose knows in that they smell like freshly baked cookies. So I'm so excited to eat these, but I actually am sharing these with friends tomorrow. So I can only eat like 1 to 2 tonight so that I have enough to share. Kind of annoying, but you know, sharing is caring, I guess. Happy holidays, right?
In my work, I often have to go and do what are called process validations, where we know, for example, in this case, we didn't have any product that had eggs in it, but if a cookie manufacturer is selling a cookie, let's say that had eggs in it, how do we know that the bacteria that may be present in those eggs has been actually killed off by the heating process? And so I've had to go in and the question that was popped into the chat box, how do we know we're done? Well, I've had to put thermocouples into cookies and then run them through tunnel ovens or bake-offs and then go and do mathematical modeling on the cookies to see how much of the predictive modeling says, yeah, the salmonella that may have been present in those eggs has been reduced by so many log reduction of process. It's ridiculous, but that's what we have to go through.
Wow. So different from my life, I'll tell you that.
I love that there's kind of, stages or, levels rather of science in baking. There is kind of like everyday science of baking, how much we're mixing something, which flour we're using, which sugar we're using. And then Dr. Prue, you're bringing the science of cooking and the science of baking to another level to, in your profession. And I love how intense it can get, but also how everyday it can get, which is kind of, substitutions and baking or rather temperatures and heat and just kind of the everyday of it as well. And my cookies I think they need a couple more minutes in the oven. So I'm just going to wait on those as well. Michael, how are your cookies looking?
Well, I have my cookies. They've come out of the oven. Now I'm just getting them to cool. I have them on my tray. So as Colin mentioned, I got some nice color around there. They've now set. I have a little bit of cracking. And I know that now they've been out of the oven for at least 7 minutes now that they've set. So I know I won't get any surprises with any collapse or anything like that.
We had a question come in on the chat box that says, I love shortbread that are small and very tall and much taller than regular cookies. And the question was, how do you bake cookies like that? And Michael and I actually have some intel because we know a baker who was a Scottish shortbread master who would make trays and trays of them to share amongst colleagues. Those tall bar-formed shortbreads are often cooked as a very large sheet. And before baking, so imagine pressing your shortbread, the dough into a cookie sheet lined with parchment. You pre-score it with a ruler before baking. And then as soon as you pull the sheet out from the oven, you would rescore it while the cookie is still hot with a knife and a ruler into bar shapes. And then after it's cooled, you can lift those bars out and eat them in a very tall, very traditional Scottish form of having shortbread.
I love that. Oh, I didn't know that. That's very interesting to learn about. This is where I feel like the art form comes into cooking and baking, because I would have never thought that's how they're made. That's very, very interesting. Colin and Michael, are you actually going to try a cookie on camera?
Oh, you know what? I will actually. I wanted to wait until it's totally cooled because my chocolate is melted. But you know what? I will have one of these right now because, yeah, we're looking good. I love a warm cookie.
That's fine.
Here you go. I'm gonna go to my close-up cam so you can see what the inside of the cookie looks like. Look at that. A nice like slab of chocolate which has melted and pooled. And I love that because, again, I did my chopped chocolate. So we have these irregular pieces of chocolate that come in all different like sizes and shapes. And I just love that. I love that in a chocolate chunk cookie. And it's delightful. Nobody is surprised. Very tasty. I use dark chocolate, which plays really nicely with the tart cherries. So I love this cookie. I'm very happy.
I'm so glad. Michael, what about you? And while I ask Michael, I'm going to hop off the screen just for a second to grab my cookies. But Michael, are you going to wait for them to cool a little more, or are you going to try one as well?
I've already started trying them. They're delicious. The smell of butter and the sugar, you can smell it. The whole area smells like butter and sugar. I'm sure I'm going to have some people walk down the hallway and because the vent's connected, and they'll be like, I smell butter. And this cookie smells like a lot of butter. It tastes like a lot of butter. It's a fantastic cookie.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. And I hope everybody at home is finding success with their cookies. Yes. And please tag all of us on social. I mean, tag RCI Science, but also tag me because I would love to see how everybody's cookies have turned out.
I'm super excited to see everyone's final products. Mine came out, they're a little, I think I might have to pull out that scraper or my grater out again. They're a little burnt on the bottom, but they're a little hot for me to touch just yet. But I'm super excited to see all the pictures. So as Colin mentioned, to my viewers, please share your photos of your progress and of your final cookies. We'd love to see them. Feel free to share them on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. You're also welcome to email them to us as well. Our email is information@rciscience.ca, or if you'd like to tag us at RCI Science. So we'd love to see them. And as our cookies have come out of the oven, and I love how good they smell, we are going to unfortunately wrap up this presentation, this bake along. So before I wrap up, I obviously want to thank our three fabulous bakers, Colin, Amy, and Michael. Thank you so much for joining us, RCI Science, and our viewers, baking along with us, trying this new recipe, and giving us all the little science tidbits along the way. I know I have some tips and tricks to try out next time. And it's really cool to kind of just know that there's so much science behind kind of the things that we do every day, and so much science behind the things that we don't really think about too much as we're baking or as we're cooking or as we're going about our day-to-day. And so I love just learning so much about the little mysteries behind our favorite treats, our favorite cookies. I know I'm sweet over savory and baking over cooking, so I love the chemistry that exists behind that. So thank you, Colin, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much for having us. I've had an absolute blast. I love doing events like this because, you know, in the world of COVID, we're doing so many virtual events like this, but you know, that extends beyond the pandemic, and just it's such a lovely way to connect with people all across the country, all across the globe. Maybe, I don't know where everyone is tuning in from, but it's been an absolute pleasure. This really took me back to my organic and inorganic chemistry classes and my physics classes and my bio classes in 2000, and I won't say, but this has been such a fun night, and thank you so much, Dr. Amy, and thank you, Chef Michael, for joining me and taking me on this scientific journey, because it's been a real blast. One for the books.
And I've just had so much fun, besides having my fangirl moment and getting to do play-by-play for such a fun group of bakers. I love the fact that the whole world is chemistry, and the best chemistry is putting all that together and creating joy. And that's what baking is all about, is that everyone enjoys and creates delight, and you come together and celebrate as friends and family. And so that's my wish. I'm really glad that you got to come and experience that chemistry with us.
It's been a pleasure being here. It's always fun to bake. This is, I think, the best job in the world. You get to bake and eat fantastic things, meet incredible people from around the world, and bake the world a better place. I look forward to hopefully doing something like this again with everybody. I hope everyone enjoys their cookies and have a fantastic day.
I love that. Thank you so much. Bake the world a better place. I love that. And my folks who are joining in, please share your feedback with us. RCI Science is always doing really fun and exciting science events. We like to really share the science in everyday life. We want to engage our public with science. And so we'd love to know how you found this event, and feedback on what you'd love to see from us in the future. So please do share your feedback with us. You can find the link on screen or in our chat box, and you can also find it in your email from Eventbrite shortly after this event. Also, with the holidays right around the corner, we have a holiday gift guide that you can find on our website. You'll find lots of little science-themed products from Canadian businesses and scientists that you can grab for your loved ones or for yourself. We're all about treating ourselves as well during the holiday season. So feel free to check out our holiday gift guide. And we're going to be back with so many more great science events in 2023. I know it's crazy to say 2023. We're just weeks away. So join us in 2023 for all of our upcoming science events. If you're not already subscribed to our newsletter, join our newsletter and subscribe to be the first to know what is happening and what we're up to. So we'd love to see you in 2023 at our upcoming events. And that kind of brings us to the end. Thank you again, all my folks who are joining us today, for joining today's presentation. Best wishes for the holidays, and I look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Thanks, everyone.